Good evening, everyone. My name is Jocelyn Che, and I'm a counsellor here at AIA, New South Wales. And it's my great pleasure tonight to welcome you. Unfortunately, we've not been able to set up the system to welcome a live audience, but this talk will be available later. It's being video recorded. And tonight we have a very interesting and relevant talk from Professor Weihuan Zhou of the University of New South Wales Law School, who is going to talk about a subject which has both general and particular application. General in that his subject is about can law and diplomacy work together, and particular in that he will be focusing on the World Trade Organization. Is it a global trading system that is fit for purpose? This topic has a particular interest for me because back in the 1980s, a couple of years ago, I was working in Beijing as the Senior Trade Commissioner for Australia when our ambassador, Ross Garno, and I collaborated. Probably one of our main tasks was to talk to the Chinese government and try and persuade them about an open trading system and encourage them to join the newly devised regional organization, APEC, the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation. And that actually happened in 1989, which was the year after I left Beijing. So I was there for all the discussions leading up to China's participation. And China was a founding member of APEC, and the next step onwards from that was to join the WTO, which it did in 2001. And I regard that, having been there as the 1980s, which was the period of China's so-called reform and opening up, as the natural and final most important step of China's reform period, when China, as you might say, came out to the world. And I'm not going to say anything more about that, but that's just the background, which explains to me why I'm so interested in tonight's topic. And as for politics and trade, well, what can you say? They're always intertwined, just like politics and sport. In fact, even currently this week, you might have read the news how the chief executive of Hong Kong, John Lee, is expected to be banned from the United States from attending the next meeting of APEC leaders, which will be held in San Francisco, because of sanctions that the US has placed on Hong Kong following the introduction of the national security law. Well, no doubt Professor Zhou is going to talk more about these and other issues, because he is the expert in international trade law, which I am not. So I will hand over to him, and I hope you will welcome him as warmly as I do. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Shea. I must say that your Chinese is very impressive. The reason I say that is because when I was working at the WTO in 2007-8, my colleague in the room forced me to learn 10 French words every day, and I did, and I forgot all of them by now. I can speak perhaps one or two French words, so that's very impressive, and thank you for the kind introduction. It is an honor to be invited to this event and to speak to this distinguished group of experts. My sincere thanks to the Australian Institute of International Affairs, New South Wales Division, for the invitation, and particularly in Jonathan and Jenny for organizing it. It is a very timely topic. When Jonathan approached me to talk about the issue about the world trading system and the dispute settlement system within the system, I thought about how can I connect with this group of audience, a very senior and experienced diplomats and in all kinds of backgrounds and expertises. And I thought that the best way to speak to this audience is to talk about the fundamentals and the fundamentals of the system, and to reflect on the past and present, and for all of us to imagine together the future. As Australia's longest existing think tank in international affairs, the AIIA has a history that predates the world trading system, which is my focus today. This system, established in 1947, was a key pillar of the post-war initiatives to reconstruct the global trading system and rebuild international relations. It was therefore, in my view, first and foremost, a product of diplomacy and political agreements. More specifically, at the time, the system was seen to be essential by governments for preventing unilateral, protectionist, and beggar-thy-neighbour policies, which had destructive impact on world trade and economic political relations before and during the Second World War. The solution was a consensus for international cooperation, which the United States pushed hard at the time towards the conclusion of the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, in October 1947. Despite being an international treaty, the GATT played a de facto institutional role for almost 5 decades, leading to the creation of the World Trade Organization, the WTO, in 1994. And the WTO's creation was a testament to the continued commitment of governments to international cooperation. Similar to its role in the creation of the GATT, the US was a key architect of the WTO. Until today, the WTO remains the backbone of what we call the global or world trading system. As I read from the AIIA's website, a core mission of this institution, I quote, is to help Australians know, understand, and engage more in international affairs. From what I can see, the value and the impact of this institution, I think its research and events go beyond the border of this country to facilitate engagement and informed debates globally. So with that mission in mind, what I'm trying to do today is to promote fresh thoughts and debates, not only within this audience, but hopefully the broader Australian and global communities. My objective is less about imposing my views, but more about providing information and perspectives to enhance understanding and engagement on this important matter. The title of my talk, as Professor Che said, entails 2 questions, 2 major questions. The first is what purposes a global trading system should seek to achieve. The second is, in light of the purposes, how law and diplomacy can work together to reform or reconstruct the system. I will spend most of my talk to discuss the first question, to lay the foundation for discussion of the second question in the Q&A. To consider the first question, a necessary first step is to reflect on the functions of the existing global trading system. The sentiments on the system, which has been based on the GATT and later on the WTO, are remarkably and consistently mixed. We have hard evidence about the positive effects of the system in creating greater economic gains for nations, contributing to the development of less developed economies, lifting millions of people out of poverty, etc. These contributions relate to what we know as gains from trade, underpinned by the doctrine of comparative advantage and welfare economics. There is also evidence and strong views on how the system has benefited predominantly multinational companies, leaving more valuable domestic industries unprotected or underprotected from cheap imports, including those facilitated by unfair trade practices, failing to ensure equal distribution of wealth, and overly constraining the policy space governments need to achieve legitimate objectives, including some of the key issues we face today: climate change, public health, and national security. So how to understand the function of the system and what it has achieved? I offer 4 general perspectives here, and we'll come back to these perspectives when I talk more about how the system may look like in the future. The first, the system is not designed or intended to achieve free trade. In reality, we never have had free of trade barriers. The goal has been pursuing freer trade by progressively reducing trade barriers and discrimination so as to generate the gains from trade. From this perspective, in my view, I think it is undeniable that the system has delivered what it is intended to achieve: liberalizing the market for business, getting governments together, agree on a set of rules for that purpose, and in a reciprocal manner. This is despite the long-standing failure of the WTO to conclude new rounds of multilateral negotiations. Second, equally importantly, is the system's function to ensure the rules created by governments to protect the value of trade liberalization are properly implemented and enforced. And particularly, the forum the system provides for discussion and notification of trade policies and settlement of trade disputes has played a vital role in detecting and dissuading unilateral protectionist and beggar-thy-neighbour policies, precisely what the system was created to do. This is despite some criticisms or deficiencies in the enforcement of transparency rules and adverse rulings of the WTO tribunals. I will come back to talk a little more about dispute settlement system in a minute. Third, the system is not purely pro-trade, and it is debatable whether it actually failed to balance trade and non-trade interests and values. To start with, the system has rules that provides the policy space for governments to resort to protectionist measures for political, strategic, and other reasons. This includes not only trade remedies, such as anti-dumping and anti-subsidy tariffs, which are used frequently and widely by governments to reduce import competition, including here in Australia. This also includes the lack of disciplines on important trade policies, such as export taxes, which are widely used by governments for all sorts of regulatory objectives. In addition, the system provides a set of exceptions to allow governments the policy space to achieve objectives relating to public health, environment, exhaustion of natural resources, consumer protection, public morals, etc. One may argue whether this list of objectives created in 1947 is already out of date. The reality is that there has been no single case where WTO tribunals can't apply the exceptions to objectives chosen by governments. Fourth, the dispute settlement system is remarkably more successful than any other international courts. Governments not only have chosen to use the system to resolve trade disputes, which led to over 600 plus disputes at the WTO, they have also been inclined to implementing adverse rulings when losing a dispute. The compliance record recorded by the WTO across WTO members was as high as around 90%. When it comes to China, the single WTO member subject to most of the criticisms about non-compliance, my own assessment is around 99% compliance rate. I wrote this in a book published in 2019, which I show that China complied in all WTO disputes that it lost until that time. There was only one case China did not comply in a very specific area. And that case was one of the most sensitive cases in all China's WTO disputes as a respondent, because it concerned about the censorship system for imported cultural goods. In short, this system has functioned well, in my view, in developing a body of case law to provide certainty and predictability for how trade rules would work, and an effective mechanism for resolving disputes and inducing compliance. This is despite the well-known shortcomings of the system, such as lengthy procedure, takes time, lack of retrospective remedies, so that countries may actually abuse the lengthy procedure to buy time for its violations of WTO rules. Now, what's the current status? Unfortunately, the global trading system today is arguably not what we have known for the past decades. It has been increasingly marginalized as major economies increasingly resort to unilateral protectionist and beggar-thy-neighbour policies. And they do so no longer in a disguised manner, but in ways that clearly ignore their obligations under the rules-based trading system. The starting point of these recent developments, as I see it, was the US blockage of the appointment of new members of WTO panel body. This has continued to make the dispute settlement system dysfunctional and subject to power politics. Around the same period, the US imposed steel and aluminum tariffs on select import sources based on national security grounds. And this was the beginning of the fast-growing abuse of national security to justify import restrictions and discrimination, which is arguably not supported by WTO rules. In all of the 4 panel decisions at the WTO on the security exceptions, the panels ruled consistently that the use of the trade instruments for security reasons is not self-judging, but is reviewable by WTO tribunals based on the relevant legal conditions. One way to question these WTO decisions is to say that they're overly restrictive on policy space, especially given the political environment globally. But it is important to remember that WTO tribunals work within the constraints of the treaty texts. That is, the security exceptions composed by GATT contracting parties all the way back in 1947. It is subject to the WTO members to negotiate how the treaty text should be reformed or amended in line with their needs today. The sad reality is that the WTO is losing its effectiveness to constrain unilateral, protectionist, and beggar-thy-neighbour policies with the abuse of national security on the rise. This reality can also be illustrated by the growing use of subsidies and other measures by governments to pursue industry policies while ignoring the spillover effects of these measures on trading partners. These policies are widely used not only to boost the growth and global competitiveness of strategic sectors, but also to promote legitimate goals such as the rise of green industry policies, and supply chain strategies. These are global issues that can't be addressed adequately at sub-multilateral levels. The WTO, however, does not yet have a feasible solution to these issues, particularly on how to gain government support to negotiate issues of subsidies, green policies, and supply chains at the multilateral level. The point of judicial interpretation of the security exceptions is also related to one of the US major criticisms about the panel body, which is the issue of judicial overreach. Again, it is highly controversial the extent to which the panel body did overstep its judicial function to make new rules in disputes. In some cases, one may argue that the parties raised the concern of judicial overreach just because they lost the disputes. In any event, the issue of judicial overreach would not be resolved by killing the panel body, because all judicial bodies, including the domestic court system and the WTO panels, the WTO arbitrators under the newly created interim appellate mechanism that the EU led to establish, can trigger the same issues and concerns of judicial overreach. One evidence of this has been major WTO members, including the US, EU, India, China, appealing panel's decisions into the void and effectively blocking the decisions from becoming binding and the subsequent enforcement mechanisms of the WTO. The reality is that the WTO is losing its effectiveness in enforcing trade rules, inducing compliance, and maintaining the certainties and predictabilities that are much needed by all stakeholders today. The lack of effectiveness of the WTO has led the governments to resort to bilateral and plurilateral approaches, which in turn is leading to growing economic fragmentation. Bilateral and plurilateral agreements are now an important part of the global trading system, making the system much more complex and unpredictable. We need more empirical studies to understand the extent to which these trade agreements have actually improved the level of liberalization and whether they have been enforced effectively in practice, as we did in Australia several years ago about how Australia's FTAs, free trade agreements, are actually used in practice. It will also take time to fully understand their effectiveness in tackling emerging challenges posed by climate change, supply chain resilience, and economic security. The reality is an ongoing deviation from multilateral cooperation to selective cooperation between allies and trusted partners, as well as an ongoing shift from addressing a full range of trade barriers to tackling select issues which may not involve commitments on trade liberalization. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, IPEF, and the flourishing bilateral deals on critical minerals are telling examples, which I will come back to talk a little bit more. Now, this leads to the final section of my talk. How should the future of the system look like? Numerous webinars and events have been organized to discuss WTO reforms. But I would argue that the fundamental question is what governments want to achieve through a multilateral trading system with or even without the WTO at its core. This is essentially a process of repurposing the system and realigning objectives among governments. This process has to be driven by governments collectively with genuine and sustained political will for cooperation. There are a wide range of issues that needs to be discussed, but let me just raise some key questions to help this audience and perhaps a wider community to think about how to reconstruct the global trading system in ways that are fit for purpose. First question, does trade liberalization remain a shared goal? From what I can see, there remains strong political will in a majority of WTO members to further liberalize and facilitate trade. Examples include the successful conclusion of the Trade Facilitation Agreement in 2013, and lately, the Investment Facilitation Agreement just last month. Both agreements have involved majority of WTO members, showing a strong global interest in reducing barriers for trade and investment, enhancing transparency and cooperation as ways to promote trade and investment flows and activities. Ultimately, these agreements provide enhanced certainties and opportunities for business and continue to contribute to capacity building, economic growth, and sustainable development, as believed by the participating governments in the WTO. While these agreements are currently plurilateral because they do not involve all WTO membership, it is important that they were concluded within the WTO, accepted or sponsored by over 100 governments, and hence are much easier, in my view, to become multilateral compared with free trade agreements. On the other hand, the critical mass approach the WTO used to push through the conclusion of these agreements shows great flexibility. It avoided the nearly impossible approach based on consensus. Another example is the recently concluded agreement on fishery subsidies, which is also based on the critical mass approach. It is important not only because it tackles a highly controversial issue on subsidies, but also because it shows the WTO's relevance and capacity to contribute to the sustainable development goals. The question I leave here for us to think about is how the critical mass approach and the enhanced flexibilities in the newly concluded WTO agreements can be applied to facilitate negotiations of emerging challenges associated with industry policies, supply chains, national security, so that we can reverse the trend of rising unilateralism and protectionism? Or what other reforms are needed to ensure that the WTO remains relevant and effective in the current context? Second question, do we want a mechanism to strictly enforce the rules. Trade rules may become meaningless if they can't be effectively applied and enforced. Interpretation, certainty, and enforcement are some of the core values of the WTO's dispute settlement system, as I just mentioned. But there is a long-standing debate about whether the system should function in a way that prefers rebalancing over compliance. And there seems to be a growing interest, particularly on the part of the United States, in making this system more flexible, to focus on facilitating settlement of disputes rather than developing jurisprudence and inducing compliance with WTO rules. So the question for us, or for governments, is which approach to choose between a system of binding obligations and a system of rebalancing with more flexibilities for settling disputes. Do we have a way to balance the two approaches? Third, what policy space do governments need? This is one of the longest lasting and most systemic issues which cuts across arguably all areas of the system. Examples include environmental protection, preservation of natural resources, climate actions, supply chain resilience, digital trade, data flow and security, etc. The essence of it is how to strike a balance in the development and application of trade rules. Ideally, this issue must be sorted out by governments themselves. It hinges on how the rules are written by governments. Governments should try to maximize clarity and certainty in the treaty texts about the policy flexibilities they may need. To the extent that they can't anticipate certain situations in the future, they should have a mechanism to also maintain flexibility for necessary future changes. If governments are unhappy about the interpretation of certain rules by WTO tribunals, they should have a mechanism to change that interpretation. The WTO have most of the mechanisms in place already, such as compensation, renegotiation, authoritative interpretation by WTO membership. Apparently, these mechanisms have not been used to the satisfaction of WTO member governments. Here, the question is, I think, how governments want to compromise and record their needs for policy space. What mechanisms they need to ensure such policy space is not unduly constrained by treaty interpretation. Fourth question, what is the boundary of a multilateral trading system? A multilateral trading system must have its focus. It can't and should not be expected to be responsible for all emerging challenges. A clearly defined boundary is crucial so that the system won't be overloaded with missions that it can't really fulfill. It is also crucial because the system won't be wrongly criticized for such failures. There are many examples, such as issues relating to climate change, national security, gender balance, distribution of wealth, etc. The WTO certainly has a role to play in these issues. But many of these issues require coordinated efforts by more than one international organization. And in some cases, such as distribution of wealth, it more hinges on domestic policy making. Either on the existing challenges or the emerging ones, governments need to reconsider the mandate of the global trading system. Final question, is multilateralism still preferred? With the proliferation of bilateral and plurilateral agreements, there is a clear shift away from multilateralism as a preferred venue for promoting trade liberalization and developing trade rules. However, as I said earlier, governments continue to use the WTO for these purposes, including negotiation and dispute settlement. This suggests that governments are becoming more strategic and pragmatic about which venue may produce an outcome effectively and efficiently. The coexistence of bilateral, plurilateral, and multilateral agreements is already a reality we live with and will remain the case for the foreseeable future. However, matters such as industry policies and subsidies, the nexus between trade and non-trade values such as climate, state-owned enterprises are global matters and require a global solution. There are studies which show that more advanced rules on these matters, such as subsidies and SOEs, on a bilateral or plurilateral level, may make stakeholders of the treaty countries worse off because other major players are left free to play by less rigorous rules. Finally, let's also think about the new generation of economic agreements, which I promised to come back to, such as the IPEF, which are not primarily aimed at trade liberalization. But can bilateral agreements adequately address issues such as global supply chain resilience? A more specific example is the ongoing friend-shoring for critical minerals, while at the same time de-risking from China. To what extent these joint initiatives can achieve their intended objectives? Should and can these issues be negotiated at the multilateral level? The question for governments here is whether multilateralism should remain a preferred venue. And if so, how may governments multilateralize more advanced rules concluded at sub-multilateral levels? Let me conclude by referring to Professor Claire Wilcox, the US chief negotiator and one of the key architects of the GATT in 1947. Reflecting on the negotiations of the GATT and the failed International Trade Organization at the time, Professor Wilcox published a book titled A Charter for World Trade. He wrote in the introduction of the book, and I quote, "We must go on in international cooperation from politics to economics, from finance to trade. World Organization for Security is essential. But if it is to succeed, we must rest upon continuous international participation in international affairs. If political economic order is to be rebuilt, we must provide in our trade relationships the solid foundation upon which the superstructure of international cooperation is to stand." End of quote. In the conclusion of that book, he wrote, and I quote, "Nothing in this world is guaranteed. In any course of action, we must weigh the risks, strike a balance, and take a chance." End of quote. In many ways, I think the global trading system today faces the same problems and challenges as those present when the system was created. In that history, international cooperation provided a way forward. Today, international cooperation remains a political choice and requires the wisdom and courage to look beyond short-term political interests for long-term stability and prosperity. Diplomacy is core to this pursuit of rebuilding the habits of cooperation and remains part of the solution to disagreements, disputes, and confrontations. However, for diplomacy to provide a desirable level of certainty and predictability, we need a rules-based system that gains genuine and sustained support by all governments. So let's weigh the opportunities and risks, strike a balance, and take a chance. Thanks for your attention.
Well, friends, I think you've been given a very masterful and comprehensive introduction to the global trading system. I hope that I'm sure we've all learnt something, and I'd like to, before I open the floor to questions, I take advantage of chairing this meeting, perhaps to ask the first question myself. I was very impressed with that retrospective look at the development of global trading issues, because as someone, as I mentioned at the beginning, was involved a few decades ago in that period when I think Australia was a leader in promoting multilateralism, I found it quite discouraging over the recent decades to see our governments, our national government, retracting from that commitment and instead concentrating more on bilateral arrangements or selective regional arrangements. And even if those, I mean, I'm nothing against a free trade agreement, but surely if we believe in multilateralism, that arrangement should be an open one, not a closed one which has exclusive advantages only for the two partners who are involved. Otherwise, the two principles just don't coalesce. We're fighting against each other. It's illogical. That's just my comment. But my question, because I think Professor Zhou and I both have a particular interest in China, so I'd like to ask the first question about China. China certainly in the time that I was involved in this was very, I would say, rapidly expanding to have the same deep degree of commitment to multilateralism that Australia had. As you look at China's participation in the WTO and in other trading arrangements, including the free trade agreement with Australia, do you see some pulling back on the part of the trade authorities, the government in China? Are they still really committed to multilateralism, or are they just following the United States and other countries and withdrawing from that position?
Should I come to the stage?
Please.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a great question. I think China, in general, is still very committed to multilateralism and the WTO. And the investment facilitation agreement I mentioned in the talk, which was concluded very recently, was the first multilateral agreement sponsored by China. And China pushed it through. And China gained a lot from the system. The system provided access for Chinese goods, services to go global in the past decades, which contributed enormously to China's economic growth. And if you look at China's official documents about China's perspective and views on the system, it's very consistent that China supports the system against protectionism and unilateralism. And China spoke many times in the WTO and outside about the abuse of national security. So I think China is still in a position that supports the system, but in some cases, when China behaves inconsistently, from what I observe, is because the US bad action. So for example, US has been the single member that appealed most of the cases into the void because of the lack of the appellate body, so we do not have a functional appellate mechanism. The US appealed most of the cases among other countries in the system. And China appealed one case into the void, and that was the case against the US won, and China appealed the panel decision into the void. So you can see this kind of clear sign of retaliation against what the US was doing. But otherwise, China has behaved reasonably well in terms of maintaining its support and activities within the system and encouraging multilateral negotiations on different timely topics. And for example, the plastic wastes, I think Australia is also part of the, the sponsoring members. And also, of course, the question about national security, which China put forward WTO reform proposals 2 times to talk about the abuse of national security. So from my observation, I think China tried or has been trying to deal with these emerging issues and trying to maintain the credibility of the system. But obviously, China can't do it by its own. Now, you will ask me about the well-known criticism about China's non-market economy and about China's compliance with WTO obligations. I think there are 2 general points I want to just reflect on, and perhaps we're going to have more discussion on this. The first is that China, by today, is still the country or the WTO member that undertakes most of the WTO plus obligations. So which means that China's WTO obligations go beyond the general rules and obligations that other WTO members subscribe to. And the second point is that when it comes to dispute settlement, China continues to implement, except for some of the cases, as I mentioned, about retaliation against the United States. So what I'm trying to say with these 2 points is just based on evidence. The question in front of us is whether the WTO obligations, China's WTO obligations, actually require China to make the fundamental reforms as expected by the United States and other trading partners. Do we have evidence, or do we have the rules in China's WTO obligation document itself? And secondly, about China's compliance with the WTO rulings, if you look at the number of disputes in which the WTO members have been respondents or defendants, the US is on the top, and followed by the EU. And the number of cases the US was a respondent in a WTO dispute was much higher than China's numbers. Right? China was about 44 or 45 cases. The US number of responding cases at least double. So what that tells us, and the second kind of perspective here is that the WTO has a system called the retaliation. So when a losing member fails to implement WTO rulings, the winning party may request for authorization from the WTO to retaliate. And the single member that has been subject to such requests, again, is the United States, followed by the EU. So I think these are the evidence that we should at least look at and think about this evidence in the context of the prevailing narratives.
Thank you. I'd now like to open the floor, and first to Chris Skinner, please.
Chris Skinner, Councillor. Thank you for a very erudite and very informative talk. I'd like to move away from the China versus US perspective and ask your opinion on the effectiveness of the World Trade Organization to deal with broader issues that are beyond trade. And you've mentioned climate change, for example. But even on simple things like the restrictions placed on barley export from Australia to China, and Australia's intention to bring that to the World Trade Organization, but they were persuaded not to. The real point I'm getting at is there's a balance between trade and other matters, and the World Trade Organization can only do so much. So how do we integrate trade with other matters?
Thanks, Chris. That's a great question, and I'm glad you talked about the barley disputes, and I'm kind of expecting that question to come. But your question is actually two sub-questions. One is kind of concerned about the traditional trade policies and trade instruments. That's anti-dumping, trade remedies. That's a very traditional part of it. And then the second part of your question is about the emerging issues about climate change and how WTO plays a role. Let me deal with the first question about trade remedies. I think the starting point to say that China is a less frequent user of trade remedies than many other countries. The traditional users include the United States, EU, Canada, Australia here. Australia has imposed anti-dumping duties against China for over a decade. China never imposed or initiated anti-dumping investigation against Australia until Bali in 2018. So if you put in that context, I think trade remedies should not be considered as a standalone issue, right? You need to put in the broader context and to see why China started this investigation at the time. Because before that, Australia had at least decades of using anti-dumping and countervailing duties against Chinese exports. And some of these duties affected China's important industries, such as renewable energy industries, such as solar panels, steel industry, etc. China did not retaliate at all. China has its own trade remedy mechanisms, but did not use it against Australia until the Bali case. So I think that broader context is quite important, and this was what I was talking to our interns here just now, that to think about why China took action in that context, right? And what actually behind China's motivation. In my view, I think it's the handful of matters that would actually be perceived by China as causing political instability in China's domestic system. So for us to understand China's trade actions or other actions, the first kind of step, I think, is to understand why and whether this matter may actually cause such concerns within China's current leadership. So if you think about Australia's call for independent investigation into the origin of COVID, Australia's position on Hong Kong Security Act, and these things are likely to be perceived in China as causing troubles to its political stability. And of course, the situations may change, but these are the things that China may be very concerned about. So I think it's very important to understand these matters, but I would also say that I don't think there are many. There might be a handful of matters that China are very concerned about. Other things remain negotiable. Another thing I would say in that context is about engagement and consultation. I think it's quite important that there is a difference between that, take an action directly without talking to China, and you take action only after you have talked to China, you have done the sufficient kind of necessary engagement and consultation with China, there will be a big difference in terms of how China responds. In terms of your question about climate change and all those national security, perhaps is also a supply chain resilience. I think WTO, as I said in the talk, WTO plays a role from the perspective of trade. But WTO is not and cannot actually provide all the solutions. Let's just use an example in Australia. When the Morrison government blocked the use of China's 5G equipment, it's certainly a security issue. So can the WTO actually provide the full answer to that issue? I'm not sure about it. Because first and foremost, the question is whether that equipment, the 5G equipment, causes security problems. And the second question is whether we have the technology and system to minimize or deal with that security risk. I don't think these questions that WTO has the competence to answer, but certainly these questions are relevant for the WTO to say whether these or other security-based measures are in violation of WTO rules.